It knows whether you'll still have color in your hair at 50 or whether you'll be fully gray by 30. And for over a century, scientists had no idea why. They knew hair turned gray. They didn't know what flipped the switch. Then one study, one gene, changed everything we thought we understood about aging, ancestry, and the strands sitting on your head right now. For most of human history, gray hair was treated as a mystery wrapped in folklore. People blamed stress. They blamed shock, grief, fear, even a single terrifying night. There's an old story about Marie Antoinette, the French queen, supposedly waking up with hair turned completely white the night before her execution. It's almost certainly a myth, because hair that has already grown out of the follicle is dead tissue. It cannot change color overnight, no matter how frightened a person is. But the myth stuck around for centuries because it fit a very human need to explain something we couldn't otherwise understand. If we couldn't see the biology, we invented a story instead. The biology, it turns out, is far more interesting than the folklore. And it starts with a pigment called melanin. Melanin is the same substance responsible for the color of your skin, your eyes, and your hair. Inside every hair follicle, there are specialized cells called melanocytes. Think of them as tiny factories. Their entire job is to produce pigment and package it into your growing hair strand, cycle after cycle, for years. When you're young, these factories run efficiently. They produce enough pigment to keep your natural color, rich and consistent. But as you age, something happens inside these cells. Production slows. Sometimes it stops entirely. And when a strand of hair grows in without pigment, it comes in gray, or in some cases, completely white. For decades, that explanation was where the science stopped. Researchers understood the mechanism of graying at a surface level, but they had no idea what triggered it. Why did some people go gray at 25, while others still had a full head of natural color at 60? Why did entire families seem to gray early, generation after generation, almost like clockwork? Doctors would shrug and say it runs in the family, which is true, but it's not an answer. It's just a description of the pattern without any understanding of the cause. That changed in 2016 when a team of researchers led by scientists at University College London set out to answer a question nobody had successfully answered before. They wanted to know if there was an actual European populations, which meant the pool of genetic variation researchers had to study, was narrow. If everyone in your study group shares similar ancestry, it becomes much harder to isolate which genes are actually responsible for a trait, because there isn't enough variation to compare against. So the researchers did something different. They recruited more than 6,000 volunteers from 5 countries across Latin America: Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and Peru. This wasn't a random choice. Populations across Latin America carry a rich mixture of European, Native American, and African ancestry, often within the same family, sometimes within the same person. That mixture created exactly the kind of genetic diversity the researchers needed. It meant they could compare hair traits across people with wildly different ancestral backgrounds and start to isolate which specific genes lined up with which physical traits. Every volunteer in the study was carefully assessed. Researchers didn't just glance at hair color and move on. They categorized scalp hair shape, whether it was straight, wavy, or curly. They assessed hair color in detail. They evaluated balding patterns. And critically, they assessed graying, cataloging how much gray hair each person had relative to their age. In male participants, they went even further, assessing beard thickness, eyebrow thickness, and whether a person had a unibrow, a single connected eyebrow rather than 2 separate ones. Every one of these visible traits was then compared against each person's full genetic profile. What emerged from that comparison was groundbreaking. The team identified 18 different genes that appeared to influence various hair traits. Some of these confirmed things scientists already suspected, but one discovery stood out above the rest because it was completely new. For the first time in the history of human genetics, researchers had identified a gene directly linked to hair graying. That gene is called IRF4, short for interferon regulatory factor 4. Now, IRF4 wasn't a total stranger to science. Researchers already knew it played some role in pigmentation, and it had been loosely connected to lighter hair colors in earlier research. But nobody had ever managed to draw a direct line between IRF4 and the specific process of hair turning gray. This study did exactly that. People carrying a particular variant of the IRF4 gene were significantly more likely to experience graying, and often experienced it earlier than people without that variant. Here's where the story gets even more interesting, and where the connection to ancestry comes in. When the researchers looked at who actually carried this graying-associated variant of IRF4, they found something striking. It appeared almost exclusively in people of European ancestry. Participants with primarily Native American or African ancestry rarely carried this particular version of the gene, even though they were part of the exact same study, living in the exact same countries, sometimes in the exact same families. This single finding helped explain something people had observed anecdotally for generations, without ever understanding why. Gray hair has always seemed to appear earlier and more frequently in people of European descent compared to people of Asian or African descent. Researchers had noticed this pattern before, but they had no genetic explanation for it. Now they had one. The IRF4 variant tied to early graying appears to have become common specifically within European populations, likely as a side effect of the same genetic changes that produce lighter hair colors in the first place. In other words, the very same genetic pathway that gave many Europeans their blonde, light brown, or lighter hair shades may have also made them more genetically prone to losing that color earlier in life. This is the part where your DNA starts to tell a much bigger story than just what's happening on top of your head. Genes like IRF4 don't exist in isolation. They're markers, breadcrumbs left behind by thousands of years of human migration, adaptation, and mixing between populations. When early humans migrated out of Africa and spread across different regions of the world, they encountered dramatically different environments, different climates, different amounts of sunlight. Over tens of thousands of years, natural selection favored certain physical traits in certain regions. Lighter skin and lighter hair became more common in populations that settled in northern latitudes with lower sun exposure, likely because lighter pigmentation helps the body produce vitamin D more efficiently in environments with less consistent sunlight. As those genetic changes accumulated over generations, they didn't just affect skin and hair color in isolation. They came bundled with other genetic side effects, including, it now appears, a greater tendency toward early graying. This is why your gray hair isn't simply a random malfunction of aging. It's connected to a genetic lineage that stretches back to decisions your ancestors' bodies made, generation after generation, in response to the environments they lived in. If you're graying early and you have European ancestry somewhere in your family tree, there's a real chance you're looking at a visible expression of that ancient genetic inheritance every time you look in the mirror. Of course, this raises an obvious question. If Europeans are more likely to carry this specific graying-associated version of IRF4, does that mean people of Asian or African ancestry never gray early? Absolutely not. Early graying happens across every population on Earth. It just doesn't appear to be driven by this same specific genetic variant in those populations. Researchers strongly suspect there are other genes, still unidentified, that drive early graying in people without significant European ancestry. The search for those genes is ongoing, and it's an area of active research precisely because the story clearly isn't finished yet. Before we get further into the newer discoveries, it's worth pausing on just how significant it was that this breakthrough came from a study built around Latin American populations, rather than the more commonly studied European cohorts that dominate so much of genetic research. For decades, a huge share of human genetics research relied heavily on participants of primarily European descent, largely because early biobanks and university-based studies were concentrated in Europe and North America. That created a real gap in scientific understanding, because traits that are common or rare in specific populations can be nearly invisible if your study group doesn't include enough people carrying the relevant genetic variation. The researchers behind the IRF4 discovery specifically chose a mixed ancestry population because they understood that genetic diversity wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was the entire key to unlocking a discovery that had eluded scientists for over 100 years of studying human hair. In a very real sense, the answer had been sitting there the whole time, waiting for someone to study the right group of people. This is actually one of the most important things to understand about the science of gray hair. IRF4 was the first gene ever linked to graying, but it was never claimed to be the only one, or even the main driver of graying overall. In the years since that original 2016 study, additional research has added more pieces to the puzzle. A follow-up study conducted on a population in Poland looked specifically at whether the IRF4 connection held up in a different, mostly European population. And it did. But that same study also identified two brand new genetic variants connected to graying that hadn't been found before. One sits within a gene called KIF1A, which is involved in transporting materials inside your cells, essentially acting like a tiny delivery truck moving supplies where they're needed. The other sits within a gene called NSMCE1, which plays a role in DNA repair and in maintaining the overall stability of your genetic code. That second connection, the one to DNA repair, might actually be one of the most important clues scientists have found so far. Because when researchers dug deeper into the biology of hair graying, they started to realize that graying isn't purely about pigment production slowing down on its own. It's also connected to accumulated damage inside the melanocyte stem cells that are responsible for replenishing pigment-producing cells over your lifetime. Every time your hair follicle goes through its natural growth cycle, resting then growing again, it relies on a small reserve of stem cells to regenerate the melanocytes that will color the next strand of hair. Over the years, exposure to oxidative stress, essentially chemical wear and tear inside your cells, along with natural DNA damage that accumulates with age, can deplete that reserve of stem cells. Once the reserve runs low enough in a particular follicle, that follicle simply can't produce pigmented hair anymore, no matter how healthy your diet is or how little stress you're under. The hair that grows out from that point forward comes in gray and eventually white because there's no melanin left to color it. It helps to picture this process almost like a savings account that every hair follicle is quietly drawing down over the course of your life. When you're born, each follicle starts with a certain reserve of melanocyte stem cells, ready to be called into action every time a new hair strand needs to be produced with color. Each growth cycle makes a small withdrawal from that reserve. For most of your younger years, the withdrawals are small and the reserve replenishes efficiently enough that you never notice any change. But oxidative stress, essentially the everyday chemical byproduct of your cells simply functioning and metabolizing energy, along with unrepaired DNA damage that naturally accumulates with age, gradually chips away at how efficiently that reserve can be replenished. Eventually, in certain follicles, the account runs low enough that there simply isn't enough pigment-producing capacity left to color the next strand of hair. That follicle then produces gray hair from that point forward, essentially permanently, because once melanocyte stem cells are depleted in a given follicle, they generally don't return. This explains why graying tends to accelerate with age rather than happening all at once. Different follicles across your scalp deplete their stem cell reserves at different rates, which is why most people experience gradual salt and pepper graying rather than an overnight transformation. It also explains why genetics plays such a massive role. If you inherited gene variants, like certain versions of IRF4, KIF1A, or NSMCE1, that make your melanocyte stem cells less efficient at repairing DNA damage or more vulnerable to depletion, your reserves will run low faster than someone without those variants. Your hair follicles simply run out of pigment-producing capacity earlier in life. But here's an important caveat that keeps this story grounded in real science rather than genetic determinism. When researchers built prediction models trying to estimate how gray someone's hair would be based purely on their genetic variants, those models weren't nearly as accurate as you might expect. In fact, when scientists calculated how much of the actual variation in graying across a population could be explained by known genetic variants, the number came out surprisingly low, under 10%. That means more than 90% of why one person goes gray early and another doesn't is still influenced by factors we haven't fully identified, or by combinations of genetic and environmental influences that are far more complex than a single gene switch. This is a crucial point, because it's easy to hear about a discovery like IRF4 and walk away thinking gray hair is entirely predetermined by DNA, as if it's written in stone before you're even born. The reality is more nuanced. Genetics absolutely plays a role, and for some people, particularly those with a strong family history of early graying, that role can be significant, but it's operating alongside other forces. Age, obviously, is the single strongest predictor of graying in every study conducted so far, more powerful than any individual gene identified to date. Stress and difficult life events also appear to play some role, even if scientists haven't been able to precisely quantify exactly how much. Certain nutritional deficiencies, particularly deficiencies in vitamin B12, have been associated with premature graying in some populations. Autoimmune conditions that affect melanocytes can also trigger graying that has nothing to do with the genes we've been discussing. It's also worth talking about how genetic testing companies have responded to this research, because in the years since the original discovery, consumer DNA testing has exploded into a massive industry. Companies that analyze raw genetic data uploaded from services like 23andMe or Ancestry now routinely offer reports specifically covering hair graying likelihood, often marketed alongside broader ancestry breakdowns. These reports typically look at whether you carry the graying-associated version of IRF4, sometimes alongside newer variants, like the ones found in KIF1A or NSMCE1, and use that information to estimate your relative likelihood of early graying compared to the general population. It's a genuinely interesting use of the science, but it's important to approach these consumer reports with realistic expectations. Remember that even our best current genetic models only explain a small fraction of why graying happens when it does. A report telling you that you carry a graying-associated gene variant is scientifically accurate, but it's not a prediction carved in stone. And plenty of people carrying these same variants never experience early graying at all, just as plenty of people without them go gray earlier than expected anyway. There's also a fascinating pattern researchers have observed around family history and premature graying specifically, meaning graying that starts before the age of 30. In studies looking at young adults with premature graying, researchers consistently found that having a parent who also grayed early was one of the strongest predictors, sometimes stronger than any other factor they measured. Interestingly, some of that research suggested that a father's history of early graying had a slightly stronger association than a mother's, which hints that certain graying-related genes might be inherited or expressed differently depending on which parent passes them down. Scientists aren't entirely sure why that pattern shows up, and it's an area that likely needs more research before anyone can draw firm conclusions about it. So where does that leave someone who's currently staring in the mirror at gray hairs they didn't expect to see yet? First, it means you're not imagining the family pattern. If your parents or grandparents grayed early, there's real genetic evidence supporting the idea that you inherited some of the same biological machinery that drives that process, whether that's a specific IRF4 variant, one of the newer variants identified in KIF1A or NSMCE1, or genes scientists haven't identified yet. Second, it means your ancestry genuinely matters here in a way that goes beyond simple curiosity. If you carry meaningful European ancestry, you statistically have a higher chance of carrying the specific graying-associated version of IRF4 that started this entire line of research. Your gray hair, in a very real sense, is a visible marker connected to migration patterns and population history that stretch back thousands of years, long before anyone in your family tree had ever heard the word genetics. It's also worth addressing a few of the myths that still circulate widely, because so much of what people believe about gray hair has little to no scientific backing. The idea that plucking one gray hair causes 10 more to grow back in its place is simply not true. Each hair follicle operates independently, and pulling one hair has no biological influence on the follicles surrounding it. Similarly, the popular belief that a single stressful event can turn hair gray overnight isn't supported by the biology of how hair actually grows. Since hair that has already emerged from the scalp is dead keratin and can't change color once it's grown out, what researchers have found instead is something more gradual and indirect, evidence suggesting that chronic, sustained stress over long periods may accelerate the depletion of melanocyte stem cells, contributing to graying over months or years, rather than overnight. The queen losing her hair color in one terrifying night story, in other words, makes for a dramatic legend. But it doesn't match what science actually understands about how melanocytes and hair growth cycles work. At the same time, it's worth remembering that graying is not a disease, not a malfunction, and not something that needs to be pathologized or feared. It's a completely normal part of the aging process for every human being, regardless of ancestry, that simply happens to show up at different times and different rates, depending on a combination of genetics and environment. There's a reason researchers describe hair graying as a genuinely useful model for studying human aging more broadly. Unlike most aging processes happening deep inside your organs, invisible to the naked eye, hair graying happens right on the surface, visible and easy to study, which makes it an unusually accessible window into how cellular aging works throughout the rest of the human body. This is actually part of why scientists remain so interested in continuing this research, well beyond simple curiosity about hair color. If researchers can fully understand the mechanisms causing melanocyte stem cells to deplete over time, that understanding could extend far beyond cosmetic applications. It could offer insight into how stem cell populations decline throughout the aging body more generally, potentially informing research into other age-related conditions where stem cell depletion plays a role. The humble gray hair, in other words, might end up teaching scientists something valuable about the aging process as a whole, not just about pigment. There are also more immediate practical implications researchers have pointed to. Understanding the specific genetic and cellular pathways behind graying opens the door to potential treatments designed to delay or even reverse the process, something that would represent a massive shift from today's only real option, which is dyeing hair to cover gray strands after the fact. If scientists can better understand exactly what causes melanocyte stem cells to stop functioning, it becomes theoretically possible to develop treatments that support or protect those stem cells before depletion happens, rather than simply masking the visible result once it's already occurred. Researchers have been cautious not to overpromise here. Nobody is suggesting a pill or a cream is right around the corner, but the identification of specific genes and specific biological pathways gives future research actual targets to aim at, which simply didn't exist before this line of study began. It's worth taking a moment to talk about how differently graying is perceived across cultures, because the genetics only tell part of the story, and the social meaning attached to gray hair varies enormously depending on where in the world you happen to be. In some cultures, gray hair has traditionally been treated as a marker of wisdom and status, something earned through age and experience rather than something to be hidden. In other cultural contexts, particularly in modern Western media and workplaces, Gray hair has often been framed as something to disguise, especially for women, where early graying can carry an outsized social weight compared to men experiencing the exact same biological process. None of this cultural framing changes the underlying genetics we've been discussing, but it does shape how people respond emotionally to discovering their first gray strands, and it's part of why research into treatments to delay or reverse graying has attracted so much commercial interest over the years, well beyond what the purely scientific curiosity alone might explain. There's another angle to this research worth understanding, one that has nothing to do with cosmetics or aging and everything to do with forensic science. When researchers identify genes tied strongly to visible physical traits, including hair graying, hair curliness, beard thickness, and even the presence of a unibrow, that information has real applications in forensic investigations. If investigators recover a DNA sample from a crime scene with no other leads, understanding which genetic variants are associated with visible physical traits could theoretically help build a partial physical profile of an unknown individual, narrowing the pool of potential suspects based on likely hair color, graying pattern, or other visible characteristics. This is still an emerging field, and predicting appearance from DNA remains far from perfectly reliable, especially for complex traits like graying that are influenced by so many combined factors. But it represents a genuinely practical application that extends well beyond simple curiosity about why your hair looks the way it does. Stepping back from the forensic and medical implications, there's something almost poetic about what this research reveals when you really sit with it. Every strand of gray hair on your head is, in a small way, a message from your ancestors. It's shaped by decisions made by human bodies thousands of years before you were born, responding to sunlight, climate, and environment in ways that eventually became written into the genetic code passed down through countless generations until it reached you. Whether you're seeing your first gray hair at 22 or you're wondering why your salt and pepper pattern seems to be accelerating faster than your friends your same age, there's a genuine, traceable biological story behind it, one that science has only just begun to fully understand. It's also worth noting how quickly this field has moved since that original 2016 breakthrough, considering how long the underlying question had gone unanswered before that. In under a decade, researchers went from having 0 confirmed genes linked to graying to having several, along with a much clearer picture of the cellular mechanisms driving the process at the level of individual melanocyte stem cells. That pace of discovery reflects broader advances in genetic sequencing technology, which has become dramatically faster and cheaper in recent years, allowing researchers to analyze far larger and more diverse populations than would have been feasible in previous decades. It's reasonable to expect that the next several years will bring even more specificity, potentially identifying the genetic variants responsible for early graying in populations of Asian and African ancestry that remain comparatively understudied in this particular area of pigmentation research, closing a gap that has existed in the science since the very beginning. And that story is still being written. Researchers continue to study populations around the world, searching for the additional genes that clearly must exist to explain graying patterns in people without strong European ancestry, since IRF4 alone can't account for graying across every population on Earth. Every new study adds another piece to a puzzle that started with a single landmark discovery back in 2016, when scientists first proved that gray hair wasn't purely a mystery of aging, but something written, at least in part, directly into human DNA. So the next time you notice a new gray hair, or catch yourself wondering why your graying seems to be moving faster than expected, remember that you're not just looking at a sign of getting older. You're looking at a small visible piece of a much larger genetic story, one connected to ancestry, migration, evolution, and the ongoing effort of modern science to understand exactly how and why the human body ages the way it does. Your hair follicles have been quietly holding on to that story for your entire life. Science is only now starting to learn how to read it, one gene, one population, one strand at a time. And everything we've covered today is only the beginning of a much longer chapter, still being written by researchers around the world. So whatever color your hair happens to be right now, whether it's fully natural, quietly turning silver at the temples, or somewhere in between, know that there's a genuine traceable thread connecting it back through your ancestry, through thousands of years of human migration, all the way down to a single gene sitting quietly inside your cells, waiting for science to keep uncovering exactly what it's been trying to tell us all along, one careful study and one honest answer at a time.